All right, so our last session today, is a more WordPress stuff, and it's about the value of an ecosystem in WordPress, and that's something worth talking about. And our moderator did a good job putting a panel together that knows a lot about community and ecosystem. So I'm just going to get out of the way and introduce Jonathan Wald. Come on up, Jonathan. Everybody, come on. Yep. Go get him. You tell me all about it.
Just get ready to hang on to your seats. We're going to jump right into this. We got a lot of ground to cover. This is a fantastic group of gentlemen to do this with. Let's just jump into it. Chris, give us a little bit of what context do you have for being in this WordPress ecosystem?
So my first entry into the WordPress ecosystem was at Automatic, the company behind WordPress.com and Jetpack and WooCommerce. And I came from the outside in a lot of ways. And so for me, it was a crash course into what are all the different components of the ecosystem. When I was there, I was doing corporate development, so acquisitions and investments, and also internal growth initiatives for different business units as well. But for me, that was eye-opening to see how massive the ecosystem really is. I mean, you hear some of these numbers that it powers 43% of the web, and that there's a large community around it, but you don't see until you see it kind of up close. You don't fully understand how big it actually is.
Excellent. Robert, how about yourself? What context do you have?
I'm loving this Game of Thrones cold open. Is there going to be a head rolling down the stage? I've been in the open source space for decades, and that's really, once you start getting into open source, you find out all the pieces, and then the biggest piece of the puzzle, outside of maybe like Linux, is obviously WordPress, and then moved into hosting, and so I really come at it from a hosting perspective. Kind of like our previous speaker discussing how that scales and manages it throughout the entire ecosystem. And you can't run WordPress without hosting, so that's one of those things.
It's a little bit harder to do.
It's a little harder.
JB, how about yourself?
Yeah, so JB, I've been into WordPress since many times and many years, and we created WP Media in 2014, where we help people having faster websites, and especially on WordPress.
Yep.
And then we have been recently acquired by Group 1 last year. There have been a lot of acquisition in the last years, and I probably think that there would be quite a few ones coming as well.
Yeah, so you have this product perspective.
Yeah, we're really focused into products.
Yeah, I love it. So we're here to talk about value, and it's a great question, also a complex one. I want to just jump into it a little bit and hear from each of you, like when you think about the value of the ecosystem, how do you measure it? What are some of the things that stand out? Chris?
Well, I guess we can think about like economic value or the impact that it has across the ecosystem, but what's interesting is there's not a centralized place where everything flows through. So, you hear lots of different numbers, $1 trillion, billion, hundreds of billions of dollars that flow through. It's all estimates. It's actually quite hard to practically measure the value. So it's actually kind of a tough challenge to figure out exactly how big the ecosystem is, but whether it's from an economic standpoint, all the different players who make their livings off have their livelihoods associated with WordPress, or the impact it has on the open web, I think that's how we think about it.
I'm curious, Chris, from your perspective, and like coming from corporate development and looking at like WordPress from an M&A perspective and investment, how did you parse through that difficulty? Because you don't have this central sort of base of numbers. It's like how do you decide that this is worth something if it's harder to get that type of data?
Talking to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Right. So there's very much a community element to it. Like we all know each other through the community. So similar to how we have CloudFest, there are WordCamps that are WordPress specific events that we go to that exist out there. So
it's a lot of context building.
That's right.
To get in there and
over time. Building it up.
Yeah, learn things. Robert, how about you? How do you think about value?
Well, what's the end thing you're looking for? I mean, the value in and of itself is decentralized because you can look at it from a whole billion different ways, whether that's the communities that grow around it, whether they're professional or personal, the actual dollar values that companies are getting, whether they're hosting companies, third-party developers, that kind of stuff. I really look at it from really tie into the sort of WordPress democratizes publishing is the ability to empower at every level. So you can start out as a single individual, just futzing around with WordPress, and then really go as far as you want with it. And it becomes a choice you make, not that some other company makes for you. And you know, open source does that in general, but WordPress really has that support system built in at every kind of, you know, professional and personal tier along that run.
Now, there's many things I love about your background. You know a thing or two about Joomla.
Yep.
And when you look at that entire ecosystem of itself, like, I'm curious, like, what stands out as different or the same to WordPress?
The easy one is the money involved. WordPress just was able to quickly get traction in a very economic sense for, you know, from the big to the small. One of the other bigger differences between those communities, I guess for full disclosure, I was former president of Joomla. You waiting for that?
Yeah.
The community is much flatter in Joomla.
Okay.
There is, you know, at least from the .org perspective, the open source project perspective in WordPress, a little bit more hierarchy and structure around that. So that's a very big difference on how things get accomplished.
And just to poke that thread for a moment, why do you think WordPress ended up being more valuable?
You know, I'm going to have to give Matt Mullenweg credit. I mean, I think he rightly, whether some people agree or disagree, kept enough control on it to drive focus around what the product means and you know, how to monetize that.
Excellent. JB, how about yourself? When you think about value broadly, like how do you measure value in the WordPress ecosystem?
The first thing I would think is just about numbers and number of websites, which is a number that we are really proud, and every WordPress user will say about that. So I will be the first to say at this time. So more than 43% of the web is powered by WordPress. So, and I believe a lot of people don't realize how much website this is and how much new websites per day this represents. And only if you target only the new WordPress websites, the value of it is enormous.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are so many things also which I see is really changing. At the time we were creating our company, what we are today is like this conference. Like a few years ago, WordPress was nothing for this kind of conference, and we see that now there are a lot of tracks dedicated to WordPress. I believe this year could be even bigger, and this is really coming into main and mass market, which is something we didn't have in the past. And I believe the value is really into the growth and the perception of how people see WordPress and corporate people see WordPress.
And I'm curious for you, when you founded WP Rocket, it was about 8 years ago?
Yeah, in 2014.
And at that time, like what value were you seeing then versus what you saw now? Because you had to make that decision, okay, we're going to invest, we're going to do this. What did you see at the time?
Yeah, the vision, I believe, was a bit different. Like we were really huge, heavy WordPress user and web performance expert, kind of. And the thing is, we were not happy with the existing solution. And that's the value we see. Is we were not happy, and probably thousands, millions of people were struggling having their website being faster. And that's really where we go really deep into, is how we can help these people, because we are in the same issue. Yeah. So let's fix our own issue first, and let's try to sell. And we really started as a side project, like, okay, let's try something. If it works, it works. And yeah, we've been really lucky, and it has been working really well.
And that's kind of the cool empowerment that you get out of WordPress. You can just like start something as a side project, and then it just like explodes.
Yeah.
It's wild how much it's changed since 2014, right?
Yeah, we can't do that anymore. And I remember a few years after, and still not that much long ago, some people when I was going to conference was asking, do you have a real job? Or
but the growth, it continues to grow. I don't know if this is where you're going next. Like, we talk about where it is today and 43% of the web and this many billions of dollars, but the momentum behind the platform is incredible. It feels like I'm not saying it's inevitable that it continues to grow, but at least today, there continues to be massive growth within WordPress, where it will grow the size of 2 Wixes every year.
Yeah.
Right. So even the growth, you know, that it adds, the number of websites it adds in 1 year, will dwarf some of the other players.
And the challenge that we all generally have in this space is that the Wix, the Squarespace, the Shopifys, they do good work, they solve different problems. They're much louder from like a marketing perspective, telling those stories. And it's like, meanwhile, WordPress just keeps growing.
And that's sort of the decentralized nature of WordPress. I mean, you can have certain companies making a lot of noise in different spaces, but it's not unified, and that's okay because again, that covers different targets and people, and
It means there's lots of opportunity too.
there's a lot of
right?
opportunity.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Controlled in one spot.
JB, one more thing I'm curious about before we move on to the next. So you started this WP Rocket 8 years ago, and you've kind of seen a lot of things change. What would you like? What are some of the things that you see as different now?
Yeah, so at the time there were really a lot of amateur, and we were.
Yeah.
And today what I see is the market is way bigger. However, it's way more difficult to start a business from scratch.
Why do you think that is?
Because a lot of professionals now really working on it and investing. And even if I really think WordPress economy is really undervaluated, there's still a lot of companies really working very deeply into it. And the thing is, it's very not really structured, and there are so many different kind of plugins, different kind of themes. So as an end user, it's getting way more difficult to just find. And the same with hosting. Like I'm an end user, I want to host my website because that's what I need. I don't know where to go because like
Cloudways.
yeah, probably. Or I might say something different.
Yes.
But yeah, you don't know because there are so many choices, and
You're gonna have to behave
it's
yourself
really difficult.
on stage. Yes. Good. I want to start that we have that difficulty now because of the growth. You have choice, right? Like it's harder to navigate all that, but there still is opportunity. Let's transition a bit to talk about like the ecosystem as a whole. One of the things that it's like we have these different categories, right? We have hosting providers, we have product companies, there's a really large service industry, right? That like we have freelancers, you have the agencies, you have these maintenance companies, hundreds of thousands of them, and continuing to grow. And when you guys think about the ecosystem and as a whole, what are some of the things that stand out to you? Chris, like, do you think of it in similar categories? Do you think of it a different way?
No, I think that's right. Yeah, there's a lot of different components to it. But even within each layer, there are different versions of each of those, right?
Yes.
So you mentioned like product companies.
Yep.
Those could be, in the WordPress space, there are themes, which historically played a big role in the functionality, and both the functionality and the look and feel of your site. Their impact is changing as WordPress evolves, but there are plugins which is just adds software, kind of specific software to your site. Others are more of a connector to a SaaS offering. There are other solutions that plug into WordPress, but or kind of interact with WordPress, but aren't specific plugins. And so there are a lot of different components to the ecosystem for sure. So it's kind of hard to map out actually in mind.
And Robert, when you think about it, because that's part of the challenge, right? Like there is so many different pieces. How do you map it? So for you, how do you wrestle with its size?
So I mean, there's sort of the standard components. You have software developers, implementers.
Yeah.
We can parse those out whether they're plugin or theme or agencies or whatnot. I like to think about the people who don't even realize they're using WordPress.
Yeah.
So those firms, those agencies, those businesses that can do all this kind of stuff. I hate using that word, but it's just such a big pool of opportunities and options that you can use a certain kind of plugin, and you're not even thinking about the fact that it's WordPress, but you are all of a sudden just in that ecosystem as a content creator, an end user of whatever features and functionality. So in fact, that really extends the reach of the entire ecosystem.
Yeah.
Because if WordPress disappears, there's going to be a lot more people in trouble than just the agencies, implementers, and developers. There are businesses that rely on these solutions that would really have to rethink everything they're doing. Yeah. So the ecosystem is much greater than the sum of its parts.
JB, from a product perspective, as someone who's built products and you're thinking about products, like how do you navigate like the size of the ecosystem?
Yeah, it's really hard. The thing we see also is hosting getting more and more involved into products.
Yes.
With two ways is they see their platform as a product because they have understood, and that's really good, and they continue to understand that if they just provide server, that's not going to work because people now want something really specific related to WordPress because WordPress people won't like what I'm going to say, but WordPress user experience is really not good.
Oh, yeah, it's true.
And I think some hosting are really understood that, and they are providing a solution to just remove the fact that people don't see WordPress or not, and they don't need to. They just want a website, so they don't care if it's WordPress or whatever. They want the best solution for them and something which is fast and something which is working really well. So they are really trying to do some products there, and they are buying, of course, products, and products in the same time, I believe, are in a way undervaluated and trying to implement hosting at the same time.
Yep.
And today, hosting take most of the value of WordPress user, I believe, because when you have a website, what do you need first is to host it, but you might not need something else. You just have a pizzeria, you want to have your menu online, you just, Right.
It's a good point. It does seem like the product space as a whole is really undercapitalized in WordPress, relative, especially when you compare it to like a SaaS, like just outside of WordPress, the other ecosystems. It's interesting. So Chris, so you spent the time at Automatic, you have this background in corporate development, you get to see a lot of what's kind of happening in this space. Then you go and start Extendify.
That's right.
You've been doing that for a couple of years. Tell us just briefly what Extendify is, and the key question that I'm looking for is like, how, if at all, has your perspective changed by kind of being in the trenches and building a product?
Yeah, so Extendify, we were essentially set out to solve the problem that JB just mentioned, which is WordPress is hard. A lot of people come to WordPress expecting to get Wix, and they get dropped into the WordPress dashboard, and they're left to figure it out. And so we hear that we all recognize that there's a large demand for WordPress. People come looking for WordPress hosted solutions oftentimes, WordPress hosting offerings a lot of times, but oftentimes 60, 70% of them aren't there a year later, right? Spend all this money on customer acquisition, and some of them are successful, and once they are, they're very sticky, but a lot of them find it too difficult. So that was the problem we set to solve with Extendify by creating essentially an experience layer on top of WordPress that gives that Wix or Squarespace or Shopify-like experience and helps users be successful, but built on a native core solution. So not creating a separate editor, a separate site builder, that kind of works just next to WordPress, but really investing in how do we take all of the good components that are already there and just make it easier for people to get started. So the perspective changing, I don't know that my perspective has changed terribly. I think the ecosystem continues to evolve, and so there was a time when, you really did need to have a separate editor and kind of different solutions, or rely on your theme. I mentioned kind of themes being more important historically.
Page builders.
Page builders, right. So some of these things are kind of changing in their importance as the ecosystem evolves. So we see those things, and we see like a lot of opportunity in just investing in kind of where WordPress is heading.
Excellent, excellent. Robert, so you have a long background in WordPress. Now you're working at Cloudways. When you think about the ecosystem as a whole, where do you tend to focus more your energy?
I think you're going to hear this in different variations across all of us, is how to reduce friction in the whole WordPress process. We come at it from the hosting perspective. People want to have cloud redundant, scalable hosting. Come to Cloudways to be able to do that and remove the friction off of it, just like you would with Extendify to remove the friction from, the typical WP admin experience. And that's just going to continue. I mean, I drive a car now. I don't know how it works. I hit a button and it goes, and that's exactly what I want. I want it to go. Maybe I want it to connect up to my iPhone or something, but I mean, there's an engine in there? Sure. I believe you there's an engine in there, but I mean, it's just one of those things where...
You want to watch YouTube videos about how to put it all together.
No, I do not want to see YouTube videos on how to put it. That's the thing. So I think in the industry as a whole, as it's maturing, it's all about reducing the friction, making it more human, more intuitive, and
I love it. JB, so post-acquisition, has it been 2 years?
Yeah, 1 year.
1 year. How, if at all, has your perspective changed on the ecosystem? You build this product, then you get acquired, had some time to sit with that. Has your perspective changed at all?
Yeah, but not necessarily regarding our acquisition. It's regarding all the acquisition which is happening in WordPress, which is something I believe very good. Because I strongly believe that WordPress ecosystem is still very undervaluated and very under the radar. Because if you think about it, like there is no or very little raising money in all the product space and all the hosting space. the hosting is taking all the value in a way, and there are probably 2 or 3 unicorns in WordPress, which are only hosting. And so this is really good because we see a lot of people looking now at WordPress and saying, yeah, there are businesses, we can do something on it. But the real question is, where do we get the value outside of hosting? Because this space is, I believe, quite plenty. Is how can I mean, there are 43% of the web. There are probably people who are struggling with a website and need something. And that's the question we need to answer is like, how can we help them?
Yeah. I think in the context of this audience, we're quite happy to see the value being captured in hosting. I'll say from my perspective, I think we're still early. It's great to see more of this like platform development work happening. I think there's a lot more opportunity for hosts to focus on very specific markets. It's going to be interesting to see how that evolves. But yes, it does feel like overall there's a lot more value in this ecosystem that's just not being realized yet. It's going to be interesting to see how that evolves. So let's talk about opportunities. You each have a lot of context for the space. You've experienced a lot of different things. And so for this audience, I want to spend some time talking about, like, given the value that we see overall, given the changes in our perspective, where do we think the opportunities are? And I love this question that Chris suggested. We're going to dive into this. Who do we think are going to be some of the winners and losers in this space over the next couple of years? Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think
Pay attention. We'll see what happens.
Well, the ecosystem has been maturing over the years, and it still is nascent. So I think it's a very relevant question, to think about. I think people that, I would say hosts in particular, who just offer a standard vanilla WordPress offering and expect users to be successful with it, I think will be losers. I think today that's the vast majority of what people get when they sign up for WordPress hosting is something that's not that different than any other place they can go. So you kind of, maybe some people might disagree a little bit, but I think there are differences, but they're not dramatic. It's very similar. And there are several out there who are working to really enhance and improve the experience, make their customers more successful. And those that really invest, like both Cloudways and One are doing, in kind of creating a differentiated, better experience, those will be the winners, I think, in the space.
Yeah.
I think in general, I would also say, part of our whole company is built around this thesis that staying native to WordPress is really important as well. That is the future of where things are going. And so I think there is risk that people invest in the wrong place. They think that there's a solution that may be relevant today, but it may not be relevant tomorrow. So I think really thinking about how is the platform going to continue to evolve, and therefore what are the solutions that are going to be needed in order to help customers be successful.
I want to expand on that point for just a moment, that staying native. One of the things I've had the privilege of seeing is a lot of SaaS companies coming into the space, and I've noticed that those who do well really embrace the how do we be native, like how do we figure this out, versus others who come in and like try to bolt their UI into WordPress, and they're like, oh, it's not working. It's like, well, I've found it really helpful to think of WordPress like as within this like operating system construct. And within that context, you can imagine someone trying to like build an iOS app, but it feels like an Android, and it's not going to work. You have to have enough context. And I think I've noticed so far, and it's starting to get better, but the folks coming from outside in, like you said in the beginning, like unless you take the time to understand the ecosystem and community, it's pretty easy to just try something, and then it doesn't seem to be working as effectively, or worse, maybe it does seem to be working, because you're getting some traction, because I've seen this with really big players coming in, but it's going to be frustrating in the long run.
Yeah. And I would say from like the UI standpoint is one element of it. The kind of actual like building blocks that you're building on top of is another component of it. There's a concept in WordPress of blocks today where people can use these different blocks to build their sites. There are a bunch of them that are included in core, and then there are hundreds, soon to be thousands, and tens of thousands of different third-party blocks that people build. Many of them are the same. You have probably dozens of image blocks, different ways to add images.
Is there a gallery block?
Is there a gallery block? Yeah, exactly.
How many?
Yeah. So I think it's really easy to kind of think, this one might be a tiny bit better than this one, so I should pick that. But the reality is, and this is just one example of how you do this, but sticking close to core and not trying to add in a lot of different changes and third-party dependencies can be helpful in that way. So
I like it. Robert, as you think about the next 3 years, who do you think are going to be the winners? Who are going to be the losers?
Geez, Chris stole half my stuff. And then you stole the other half.
You'll be fine.
I love really looking at WordPress as an operating system.
Yeah.
I mean, at some point, we're just going to start saying it's going to be the content operating system, and everything else will come on there. So and we're using multiple examples, so I'll throw just another one. A lot of stuff is going to get commoditized. To your point exactly, if you're not trying to, do something different, you can get hosting for here for $5. You can get hosting here for $5. You can get one of 30, image plugins. And what does that mean? So a lot of it gets commoditized. How do you rise to the top? You really have to innovate on top of that. And I really do love the perspective of staying with core. I mean, it's valuable to the community as a whole, because then the community can come in and say, yeah, if we're doing cool stuff with core will expand and it'll be more valuable to everyone, and we don't necessarily have to be looking through a shopping cart of lists of different plugins, because we've enabled people to do that more locally somehow.
So I want to push on that for a moment. Staying in core makes a lot of sense. What if core is not moving fast enough? What if the innovation's not happening?
And we've touched on some of those. So can we build layers on top of core that don't necessarily mucks up the content models underneath?
Yep,
that's right.
Because that's the tricky part. I mean, you can do all sorts of cool stuff, but all of a sudden, if you're injecting very proprietary data into your WordPress database, then we want to migrate off of whatever tool you're using, and now you got tons of just cruft. And how do you repurpose it? How do you reuse it? Sorry.
And create this lock-in.
And ultimately, then you have this lock-in.
Whoever built that may be helpful, but to the customer, that's not, right? If you have to use this solution in order to ever do anything again with your site, then that can be
a lot of page builders made that mistake.
Yep. Well, that's the perfect example.
It's an understandable one, but the net effect is that you use this page builder. If you want to switch, you can't really switch.
No, you're just rebuilding the whole thing from scratch.
Yeah, and that's also the issue. How many page builders do we have?
Yeah.
And what choice do I have as a user? Which one I'm going to choose?
And it's interesting, too, to kind of look at that history. Page builders were really at a strong place from a few different perspectives. And then core says, okay, we need to work to solve this problem. It's a very hard problem to solve.
Well, both, technically, but also politically.
Especially.
Because that's how much do you want to, infringe on someone else's, business by saying, well, we're just going to co-opt this and just throw it into core.
It's all open source. You can do it.
I mean, you can, but, the trick is, how do you do that without all of a sudden looking like the open source project that just eats everyone else's
Well, and you said a key
lunch.
point. I think for anyone thinking about building in WordPress, this idea of making it like work with core, it's more, at least in my experience, and I think you're saying the same, it's more about understanding like the content model and the principles at play, right? Because there's opportunity to innovate and to do different things with interfaces and to experiment, but like you need to have that base understanding of how it works. And one of the big reasons is compatibility with other things, right?
But then here's the irony. The better you do exactly that, you're going to wind up having lock-in anyway, because people will just feel more comfortable utilizing those services and tools.
Good kind of lock-in, though.
Because it's the good lock-in. It's like, oh, that really worked in, and I know I can leave, but because it all works so well, I don't need to.
You see this with form builders quite often, where it's like, you can use any number of form builders in WordPress. Like, you're not locked from one to the other. You can, but people become comfortable. I think those are good examples where they're still using the core APIs, the core pieces, and it just works. I like it. JB, how about yourself? As you think about the next couple of years, who's going to win? Who's going to lose?
The first thing I would think is like the winners will be the one who really invest into WordPress. I mean, not necessarily money, but time, and take time to understand what WordPress is, and especially the community, which is very specific, and a lot of people don't understand that. We have seen a lot of businesses seeing WordPress and say, okay, let's bring some money, bring some people into it, and we'll crash everything. But it doesn't work because there are some kind of rule into how you operate a business into WordPress, and you need to make sure to follow all the rules because at the end, and that could be in danger, you are building something on something else, on WordPress, and WordPress can decide to integrate your features into core, which I believe never really happened. I don't remember of plugins or themes which have been shutting down because of WordPress implementing things into the core.
Just on that point, I mean, the general philosophy in core is that the only things that make it in are those that serve the 80%.
Yeah.
And with an ecosystem this big, so sure, if you're going after the whole thing, yeah, it's a real risk to consider, but not necessarily a negative. But in general, for people developing products focused on particular markets, I'd say it's quite a small risk because WordPress, for better or for worse, I think for better, is quite slow.
Yeah, it's very slow with the size of WordPress. It can be only slow. Yes. And even if there is a huge amount of contributors, I think it's like 500 or 600 of contributors per release, which is a huge amount. But back to the question, I think the one who are able to target the end users who don't understand things, like they just want a website.
Yes.
And if they find a good solution to help them, probably there would be a huge value to provide to that. But at the same time, being able to target the people who need something way more technical. And I'm specifically talking about hosting, there are a few hosting who understand that and who are able to provide both solutions. And I think Automatic is doing that in a specific way, which is working really well for them.
I like it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting when JB was talking about, you mentioned the increase in M&A activity in the WordPress space. Has really been over the past couple of years, and there's a lot more, like you said, more to come, I'm sure. A large part of that has historically been to add a team member, full teams that are able to that really understand the space. It's not necessarily just about the product. It's about how do we add this capability to our organization. And some will have the capabilities to do that. Others will have to rely on partnerships and other ways of kind of bringing that knowledge in. But it can be quite effective, I think. Yeah.
Excellent. Chris, for hosting providers interested in growing in the WordPress ecosystem, so it's great. We're seeing a lot more interest. People are, whether it was the original intent or they're just looking at the realities of more and more of their customers on it. What are some of the opportunities that you see for hosts specifically?
To influence the growth of WordPress?
Rather to capitalize on the growth.
Yeah.
What are the if a hosting provider is listening and they're like, okay, what can I do to realize more value in serving this ecosystem? What are the opportunities that you see?
Yeah, I think it's similar to what I've talked about already a little bit, but I'll just kind of crystallize it a little bit more. But it's how do you help users be successful with WordPress? Yeah. There are thousands and thousands of WordPress users every day who sign up and fail, and they go to Wix or they just don't. They go to Facebook and or create a WhatsApp present, whatever it is in your kind of context. So hosts have a real opportunity and you could say responsibility to help those users be more successful. And I think in doing so, it can dramatically change the economics of the hosting business, where you're not kind of every dollar you spend to acquire a customer, if you can increase their success and increase retention, that has a huge impact on lifetime value and the kind of economics of growing the business. And it also supports WordPress in that way, because it's just 1,000 more users that are there being successful, contributing value to that ecosystem. So it's self-perpetuating in a lot of ways. So
yeah.
That's how I think about it. I think it's one thing to just, hey, we're gonna kind of pre-install this plugin or something like that, or do something like that. I think we're in the early days of what is possible, for hosts to do to create a better WordPress experience, and those that really jump out in front and lead in that regard will succeed and be rewarded for that.
Excellent. Robert, I don't expect you to give away any secrets.
No secrets. Even worse, I'll go to a metaphor that I'm going to pull out from the last century.
Hear it.
Big Blue. We remember who Big Blue was? IBM. They started out building hardware.
Yep.
Building computers, machines. They grew and expanded by exactly what Chris is talking about, finding solutions to empower their end users, not just a bunch of bits, bytes, metal, and cables. Yeah. That's how you grow, and that's how they. If we look at the hosting industry, that's how it's going to succeed, by not just providing bare bones hardware, bare metal for all you folks here. So it's not just about bare metal, it's really providing something above and beyond that, because bare metal is commoditized. I can go over here, over there, grab some wires, some CPUs, some RAM, and call it a day. But what's that value proposition? And the smart companies, not just hosting and product especially, are going to find what's that pain point and what's the value proposition. People are willing to pay a little bit more to be much more successful with what they're using.
One of the things I've noticed and I've been happy to see is more hosting providers focusing on specific markets, whether it's a particular category of business, whether it's geographic, whether it's like language-based. Because in theory, for instance, we can work with anyone,
Yeah.
right? But in practice, especially as the ecosystem matures, at least in my experience so far, it seems like there's a lot more value to be had by saying, hey, we focus on serving this particular market. And you can, of course, serve as many of them as you want. Curious, do you agree, disagree?
Well, I think very similarly to how the WordPress project works, it's getting more and more relationship driven. And what is that relationship? That relationship in this tight example might be we both understand the same space you want to be in. So you as a customer are a medical SaaS provider. We understand HIPAA compliance and data retention and all that. So if you go in that space and you build that level of trust, that's what's going to drive it. It's not going to be, I can just roll up to McDonald's and get another hamburger. It's going to be really understanding the end users or the multiple end users in that supply chain and their needs.
I think I worked at WooCommerce previous, and one of the things that stood out there is I love seeing more and more hosting providers focus on WooCommerce because it's different. It's in WordPress, but it solves a different set of problems, and the way you approach it is different. Looking forward to seeing more of that.
Well, one thing I don't think we've really, a point that maybe not very well appreciated is that WordPress is a platform that powers a very simple travel blog all the way to enterprise, whitehouse.gov and Facebook's marketing pages and everything in between. And so when you think about, I can't think of anything that serves that wide of an audience, everything in WordPress is at least in one category or another, segmenting some way. And even a segment, we focus, as an example, on SMBs. Within the context of WordPress, that is unbelievably massive. So there's a huge opportunity. Even probably medical SaaS providers is actually a pretty big market in and of itself. So I don't know. It's easy to think about, okay, here are my customers who come in for WordPress. Here's what they look like. But there's a huge swath of different variety of them. So.
But most of the people are focusing on SMBs. I mean,
think there is a lot.
WordPress.
It's been interesting too. To see some of the enterprise growth. Like WordPress historically had that blog-specific focus, right?
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's
that. But a lot of people have lost track of how much it's evolved. There's a lot of application development happening. Business processes and systems are being run on WordPress. JB, from your perspective, what are some of the opportunities that you see? You have this product background, you're now part of a hosting company. Yeah. What are the opportunities that you see for hosting the space?
I think that if some people understand that they can provide a really end-to-end solution, there would be huge opportunities, and really targeting specific group. And that's the beauty and the thing which is really difficult with WordPress is you have everything. So you have really small websites like the pizzeria, the restaurant, whatever, the blog, the photographer, and it's really hard to really find this group of people and to classify them. And I think even it's really hard, it's still a really huge opportunity to find probably a common pain between these people and targeting them probably in a different way. But that would be a lot of opportunities. Some are really targeting very specific people, like Flywheel. I mean, they used to where they were. It's a hosting company where they were targeting creative people. And they were very successful because they were providing everything related to designer, to photographer, and it was really working well. And at the end, that's something we don't really see that much. And probably that could be something which could be an opportunity, is really to try to target specific group of users.
JB, last question for you. So if a hosting company is looking to acquire a product in the space, especially a product that's already has good traction in WordPress, what advice, if any, would you have for them, based on your experience?
Yeah, good question. So I need to measure what I'm going to say. No, the thing is they simply need to focus on what they do the best and focus on their products. Because at the end, you can do whatever you want, but if you don't have customers, and because if you have bad products, you won't have customers. So just focus on your products and work on it, and customers will come all alone. In a way, of course, there are tons of work in customer acquisition, but yeah, just focus on your product. And companies and hosting companies will be interested, but I really hope that these things is going to shift, where products company are going to buy other products with the size of hosting. And I believe this will probably move, especially with a lot of products company related to WordPress are more doing SaaS, really on subscription basis with higher price, because it's still an issue for products like us to sell to a higher price. And if we compare to Shopify, I guess an extension on Shopify is like 20 euros per month in average, where on WordPress, I don't have the exact numbers, but that would be like 50 euros per year, and that would be quite expensive. And if we're able to find a way to raise the value proposition and at the end the price as a product, that's something which could help a lot.
Excellent, excellent. Well, that's our time. I hope this has been useful for you guys, gentlemen. I really appreciate each of you taking the time to talk about this with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you.